about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
The people who, in ancient times, occupied the bridge of land at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean between Egypt to the south and Mesopotamia to the north are known as Canaanites, after the name given in the Bible to describe both the region and the people who lived there. Though they were not a single ethnic group, many of them spoke the same Semitic language, used the same system of writing, worshipped the same gods, and lived in the same kinds of communities. But one group of Canaanites came to be distinguished from the others, not by its own account, but because it was the only one that came into regular contact with the cultures across the Mediterranean. This was the people whom the Greeks called Phoenicians. This name, which in Greek was Phoenix, was closely associated not only with the Phoenicians themselves, but with two specific aspects of their culture for which they had become famous. First, the purple dye they produced from a local mollusk and used to dye fabrics that were so expensive they came to be associated with royalty. And second, the date palm that grew in the eastern Mediterranean. It has both of these meanings in the work of Homer, which dates from around 800 BCE. Though it has often been suggested that it was the Phoenicians who were named after the dye, this is disputed. Phoenix occurs in the Mycenaean Greek of the later 2nd millennium BCE, where it refers to the dye and the palm tree, but not to the people. It has also been suggested that the name Canaan itself, which is found in Mesopotamian texts as early as 1500 BCE, referred to this purple color. Like other Canaanites, the Phoenicians lived in independent city-states that were often at odds with one another. The most important of these were Sidon, Byblos, and Tyre, which is found in Egyptian records as far back as the early 2nd millennium BCE. The region was part of the conquests of the Egyptian king Thutmose III, along with the rest of Canaan, in the 15th century. It was administered by Egypt until the time of the Bronze Age collapse of the 12th century, and then it was conquered by the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I in the early 11th. But unlike the larger powers in the region, Phoenicia did not seem to have suffered economically from the changes of this era. In fact, it took advantage of the reduced power of Egypt and Assyria and the disappearance of the Hittite Empire to expand its trading contacts. It was then that it went from a collection of local city-states to a maritime power that had trade contacts and colonies across the Mediterranean as far as Spain, from which it got silver, and Britain, from which it got the tin used to make bronze. The leading power in this expansion was the city of Tyre. Two of its kings in the 10th century, Abibal and his son Hiram, are believed to have strengthened their power over the city and increased the wealth of its citizens by taking away some of the power of the city's priesthood. They did this by replacing the divine couple of El and Asherah with a new god named Melkart, meaning king of the city, who was specifically associated with Tyre and became the center of worship in its colonies across the Mediterranean. And when these colonies came into contact with the Greeks, Melkart was identified with the traditional Greek hero Heracles. The Phoenicians participated in Mediterranean trade in several ways. As the westernmost point of the land routes that connected Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the lands to the east, they were able to bring the goods produced in those places to points in Greece, Sicily, North Africa, and Spain, and they produced many of the same luxury goods made by other Canaanites, such as ivory carvings, metalwork, glass, and dyed textiles. They also built their own ships from the cedars that grew on Mount Lebanon, and they made technological improvements, such as the keel, and built artificial harbors that made ports more accessible to their ships by taming the local currents. They became known throughout the Mediterranean for their skill as sailors, which is mentioned in Homer's Odyssey. As their trade expanded, the Phoenicians, and above all the city of Tyre, established colonies in western Sicily, Sardinia, western Spain, southern France, Cyprus, Malta, and North Africa. The last of these developed into the city of Carthage, from the Phoenician for New City, which became a trading power in its own right, and eventually took direct control of the colonies in Sicily and Spain. The period of Phoenician expansion across the Mediterranean began around the same as, or not long before, the era when the Neo-Assyrian Empire was conquering cities along the coast and in Asia Minor, but for a long time its campaigns against Asia Minor, Syria, and the Kingdom of Israel did not severely affect the states of Tyre and Sidon, which had favorable relations with the Assyrians. A record of the Battle of Karkar in Syria, which was part of a rebellion against King Shalmaneser III in 853, 3 launched by the Canaanite, Israelite, and Aramaean states, does not list Tyre or the other Phoenician cities as participants. Etobal, the king of Tyre in the first half of the 9th century, was free to conquer his rival Sidon and the other Phoenician cities, and to establish new colonies in Cyprus and Libya. Tyre also had particularly close connections with the Israelite kingdoms to the immediate south. In the 10th century, Abibal sent timber to King David, and Solomon purchased more from his son Hiram to build his temple and palace. The two states also cooperated in an expedition to the eastern coast of Africa. To cement this relationship, Jezebel, the daughter of King Etobal, married the northern Israelite king Ahab. Etobal's son, King Baal-ezer II, is listed in 841 BCE as one of the vassals who paid tribute to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, who had conquered the area but left Phoenicia with some degree of independence. There was also a treaty between Tyre and King Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century, though he annexed most of the rest of Phoenicia outright, and with Esarhaddon in the 7th. These treaties gave Assyria's representatives the right to a voice in the affairs of the Tyrian state. It could also restrict the export of Phoenician cedar wood to states with which it was in conflict. In 721, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos participated in a rebellion of Syrian and Palestinian cities that broke out after Sargon II became king of Assyria, but he was able to put down this rebellion. In 715, he assisted Tyre against Greek pirates and used its ships to transport his troops since he did not have a navy of his own. Sidon rebelled again under Esarhaddon, who destroyed the city entirely. With the defeat of the Assyrian Empire toward the end of the 7th century, Phoenicia came under the control of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, but there were further rebellions, and King Nebuchadnezzar besieged Tyre for 13 years, starting in 587, though in the end he settled for forcing it to pay tribute. Both the prophet Ezekiel, who lived when the Babylonians were at the height of their power, and the prophet Zechariah, who lived not long afterward, predicted Tyre's eventual destruction, though this did not actually happen. With Cyrus the Great's defeat of Babylonia later in the 6th century, Phoenicia became part of a Persian province that included most of the coastal region, but its cities were allowed to continue governing themselves under their own kings, rather than being placed under Persian governors. They now built and sailed ships for the Persian navy and were part of the invasion force that attacked the Greek mainland in 490 and again in 480. Alexander the Great arrived in the area in 333 BCE, toward the beginning of his campaign against the Persian Empire, before moving eastward to conquer its heartland. The city of Tyre, which was well defended because it was partly on an island off the coast, resisted the siege laid by his army, but Alexander was able to overcome it after 7 months by using tree trunks and debris from the mainland part of the city to build a causeway that connected it to the island. After Alexander's death, Phoenicia became part of the empire of his general Ptolemy and the dynasty he founded in Egypt. It then passed, along with Palestine, to the Seleucid dynasty, which held Asia Minor and the territories to the east as far as Mesopotamia. Even as the cities of Phoenicia were being increasingly dominated by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Tyrian colony of Carthage was gaining power in the western Mediterranean and becoming the protector of the other Phoenician colonies in Sicily and Crete. Unlike those colonies, Carthage benefited not only from its position along the trade routes, but from the natural resources in its vicinity, and it started to expand its territories along the North African coast to recruit soldiers from among its subjects, and to use its wealth to hire mercenaries. During the 5th and 4th centuries, it fought several wars with the city of Syracuse, the most powerful of the Greek colonies in Sicily, which was attempting to unify those colonies under its leadership and conquer the island's Phoenician settlements. These conflicts were not new. The two peoples had often been at odds ever since they had begun to send colonists to the western Mediterranean in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, and Sicily was close to both. As a consequence of these wars, Carthage lost most of its Sicilian colonies. It then came into conflict with the Roman Republic in the 3rd century over Sicily, and then over Spain, where Rome had Greek allies. The second of these wars, called Punic after the Latin name for Phoenicia, nearly cost Rome its dominance over the Italian peninsula after the Carthaginian general Hannibal invaded it, and many of Rome's Italian allies, who did not like the demands it made of them, threw in their lot with him. But in the end, Rome was able to defeat Hannibal and invade Carthage itself in order to render it militarily impotent. Because of this war, and in particular because of the massive defeat the Roman forces suffered in 216 at Cannae in southern Italy, Carthage loomed so large in the Roman imagination that Hannibal became a boogeyman used by Roman mothers to get their children to go to sleep. The 1st century CE poet Virgil set part of his epic, the Aeneid, which is about the mythical founding of Rome, in Carthage, where the hero Aeneas falls in love with its queen, Dido. There is also a comic play from the time of the Second Punic War, the Poenulus, or Little Phoenician, whose title character is a parody of a Carthaginian merchant who delivers his lines in his own language because he can't speak Latin. Carthage finally came to an end in the 2nd century after the Republic decided to destroy the city and turn its territory into a province called Africa. Phoenician cities, like other Canaanite cities, were traditionally governed by kings, though with the consultation of a group of 30 wealthy merchants called adirim, meaning mighty. This in turn was dominated by a single important family, which could change over time. But by about the 6th century BCE, Tyre was governed by a pair of judges, or shoftim, apparently the same sort of officials described in the Bible as the leaders of tribes before the monarchic period. These judges, who were elected by the important families, presided over the council of adirim and the law courts. They also submitted bills to an assembly made up of all the citizens. Their powers were limited not only by the other branches of government, but by the fact that they could veto one another's decisions, and only served for short terms of office. There was also a group of 104 men who supervised the government and the military, whose leaders were kept separate from the civilian branches of government. Greek writers like Aristotle considered this kind of system as fair as any they knew, and it was later compared favorably with the constitution of the Roman Republic. Along with their forms of government, the Carthaginians are singled out in our classical sources for practicing child sacrifice, just as the Bible condemns their Canaanite cousins for passing children over the fire, or to Molech at places it calls Tophets. Though the Bible takes the term Molech to be the name of a god, modern archaeological research suggests that it actually referred to a type of sacrifice that could include either animals or human beings. Excavations in Carthage have suggested that the practice of child sacrifice was declining until the city began to suffer defeat at the hands of Rome, when it picked up once again. The Romans themselves expressed horror at this tradition and banned it entirely once Carthage became a province. Perhaps the most famous of the Phoenicians' contributions to Western civilization is the alphabet, which was first developed around the 11th century BCE for writing in Semitic languages. The Phoenicians themselves may not have invented this script, as the oldest inscriptions that make use of it are from other parts of the Canaanite world, but they applied it to their record-keeping and inventories and spread it to the people they traded with. As we learned, there were already writing systems in Egypt and Mesopotamia when this happened. In fact, the characters of the alphabet were borrowed from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but these were much less convenient than the Semitic system because hieroglyphs and cuneiform represented both specific syllables, combinations of vowels and consonants, and entire words. This meant that scribes needed to learn how to write hundreds of different characters, whereas the 22-letter alphabet was so practical that it could be adapted for Greek, Latin, and Etruscan, even though they weren't Semitic languages. The Greeks made two major changes to the system. They switched the writing direction to left to right, and because the Semitic alphabet only used consonants, they turned some of those into vowels. They also added several more letters to account for sounds specific to their own language. The Greeks did, however, keep the old letter names even though they were meaningless to them. Beta, for example, came from the Semitic word for house. Though our earliest examples of written Greek come from around the 9th century, later Greek writers believed that the Phoenicians were a part of their distant mythical past. The founder of the Greek city of Thebes was supposedly a Phoenician prince named Cadmus, whose name may be connected with the Semitic word for east, and who was, according to Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, responsible for introducing the alphabet around 1500 years before. By the 1st century BCE, both Phoenicia and its former colonies had become part of the Roman Empire. Tyre continued to enjoy the formal independence it had traditionally been granted in the past, and was paid special honors by the imperial court, but the dominance that the Phoenicians and the Greeks had enjoyed over Mediterranean trade was replaced by a single Roman sea that was open to all, and new ports like Alexandria in Egypt were added to the old ones, and thus ended the glory of the Phoenician civilization. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.